If we keep in view the preceding background, we can easily find out the problems that were confronting the community at that time. They were to make the whole of Arabia a perfect Dar al-Islam, to extend the influence of Islam to the adjoining countries, to crush the mischiefs of the hypocrites, and to prepare the Muslims for jihad against the non-Muslim world. Now that the administration of the whole of Arabia had come in the hands of the believers, and all the opposing powers had become helpless, it was necessary to make a clear declaration of that policy which was to be adopted to make her a perfect Dar al-Islam. Therefore several measures were adopted, that is, a clear declaration was all the treaties with the mushriks were abolished, and the Muslims would be released from the treaty obligations with them after a respite of 4 months, verses 1 to 3. This declaration was necessary for uprooting completely the system of life based on shirk, and to make Arabia exclusively the center of Islam so that it should not in any way interfere with the spirit of Islam nor become an internal danger for it. A decree was issued that the guardianship of the Kaaba, which held central position in all the affairs of Arabia, should be wrested from the mushriks and placed permanently in the hands of the believers. Verse 12 to 18, that all the customs and practices of the shirk of the era of ignorance should be forcibly abolished, that the mushriks should not be allowed even to come near the house. Verse 28. This was to eradicate every trace of shirk from the house that was dedicated exclusively to the worship of Allah. The evil practice of Nasi, by which they used to tamper with the sacred months in the days of ignorance, was forbidden as an act of kufr. Verse 37. This was also to serve as an example to the Muslims for eradicating every vestige of the customs of ignorance from the life of Arabia and afterwards from the lives of the Muslims everywhere. In order to enable the Muslims to extend the influence of Islam outside Arabia, they were enjoined to crush with sword the non-Muslim powers and to force them to accept the sovereignty of the Islamic State. As the great Roman and Iranian empires were the biggest hindrances in the way, a conflict with them was inevitable. The objective jihad was not to coerce them to accept Islam, they were free to accept or not to accept it, but to prevent them from thrusting forcibly their deviations upon others and the coming generations. The Muslims were enjoined to tolerate their misguidance only to the extent that they might have the freedom to remain misguided if they chose to be so, provided that they paid jizya. Verse 29, as a sign of their subjugation to the Islamic State. The third important problem was to crush the mischiefs of the hypocrites, who had hitherto been tolerated in spite of their flagrant crimes. Now that there was practically no pressure upon them from outside, the Muslims were enjoined to treat them openly as disbelievers. Verse 73. Accordingly, the Holy Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam set on fire the house of Swilam, where the hypocrites used to gather for consultations in order to dissuade the people from joining the expedition to Tabuk. Likewise, on his return from Tabuk, he ordered to pull down and burn the mosque that had been built to serve as a cover for the hypocrites for hatching plots against the true believers. In order to prepare the Muslims for jihad against the whole non-Muslim world, it was necessary to cure them even of that slight weakness of faith from which they were still suffering, for there could be no greater internal danger to the Islamic community than the weakness of faith, especially where it was going to engage itself single-handed in a conflict with the whole non-Muslim world. That is why those people who had lagged behind in the campaign to Tabuk or had shown the least negligence were severely taken to task and were considered as hypocrites if they had no plausible excuse for not fulfilling that obligation. Moreover, a clear declaration was made that in future the sole criterion of a Muslim's faith shall be the exertions he makes for the uplift of the word of Allah and the role he plays in the conflict between Islam and kufr. Therefore, if anyone will show any hesitation in sacrificing his life, money, time and energies, his faith shall not be regarded as genuine. Verses 81 to 96. If the above-mentioned important points are kept in view during the study of this surah, it will facilitate the understanding of its contents. Subject of Surah: Problems of Peace and War. In continuation of Surah Al-Anfal, this surah also deals with the problems of peace and war and bases the theme on the Tabuk expedition. Topics and their interconnection. Understanding. Verses 1 to 12. This portion deals with the sanctity of treaties and lays down principles, rules and regulations which must be kept in view before breaking them, in case the other party does not observe them sincerely. Understanding. Verses 13 to 37. In this portion the Muslims have been urged to fight in the way of Allah with the Mushrik Arabs, the Jews and the Christians, who were duly warned of the consequences of their mischievous and inimical behavior. Understanding. Verses 38 to 72. In this discourse, the Muslims have been told clearly and explicitly that they will inherit the rewards promised by Allah only if they take active part in the conflict with Kufr, for that is the criterion which distinguishes true Muslims from hypocrites. Therefore, true Muslims should take active part in jihad, without minding dangers, obstacles, difficulties, temptations, and the like. Understanding. Verses 73 to 90. This portion deals with the problems of hypocrites and lays down rules and regulations governing the treatment that should be meted out to them and points out their distinctive marks from true Muslims. Understanding verses 91 to 110. This portion deals with the case of those who remained behind and did not accompany the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for jihad to Tabuk. For this purpose they have been separated in different categories, that is, the disabled, the sick, the indigent, the hypocrites, the believers who realize their guilt and punish themselves before the return of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from Tabuk, and those who confess their error. Their cases have been dealt with in accordance with the nature and extent of their offense. Understanding verses 111 to 118. In order to make their noble qualities look all the more conspicuous and dignified by contrast, the characteristics of the believers have been mentioned, and they have been reassured that Allah, the Sovereign of the universe, is their helper and guardian. Accordingly, because of their sincerity, He has forgiven the 3 believers who did not take part in the expedition. Understanding verses 119 to 127. In the concluding portion, general instructions have been given to the believers for their guidance. Understanding verses 128 to 129. This is the conclusion. Follow the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is gentle and compassionate, and your greatest well-wisher, and trust in Allah, the Lord of the universe. Alhamdulillah, we have completed the reading of Surah at Tauba. Thanks for the time and attention. Soon we will be bringing next Surah commentary to our viewers. Like, share, and subscribe. Jamil TV.